The bridge of the mighty dreadnought Eternal Dominion stretched across 1/2 kilometer of polished metal and glowing displays. Admiral Kelthan stood at the center, his forearms moving gracefully across holographic controls that managed fleets spanning entire star systems. For 3,000 years, the Vorthak Empire had perfected the art of war through mathematics and precision. Every battle simulation ran through quantum computers that calculated victory probabilities down to the 3rd decimal place. Every weapon fired according to algorithms that had been refined across centuries of conquest. Every soldier moved in formations so perfect they resembled choreographed dances rather than combat. "Sir, the human delegation has arrived," announced Subcommander Vexnala, her crystalline voice echoing through the vast chamber. Kelthan's secondary eyes remained fixed on his tactical displays, while his primary gaze shifted toward the docking bay feeds. Her small battered transport ship had just locked onto their pristine station. The vessel looked like it had been through several wars, which, according to their files, it probably had. "Humans," he muttered, tentacles twitching with amusement. "From Earth. Population 8 billion. Military conflicts in recorded history, approximately 15,000 major wars, countless minor skirmishes." He paused, letting the absurdity sink in. "They actually fight each other more than they fight anyone else." The bridge crew, tall, elegant beings with skin that shimmered like oil on water, exchanged knowing glances. The Vorthak had eliminated war from their homeworld 2 millennia ago through superior intelligence and planning. These humans were clearly primitive. Captain Li Jinho stepped into the command center, his boots clicking against the smooth floor. Behind him marched 20 soldiers in worn combat gear that looked ancient compared to Vorthak technology. Their uniforms bore patches and scars that told stories of campaigns across hostile worlds. "Captain Li Jinho of the Earth Defense Forces, reporting for integration assignment, sir," he said, his voice steady despite standing before the most powerful military leader in the galaxy. Kelthan finally turned his attention to the humans. They were smaller than he expected, built compact and dense like their gravity-heavy homeworld had forged them from steel rather than flesh. What struck him most were their eyes, not the color or shape, but what lived behind them. These soldiers looked like they had seen things that would break lesser beings. "Integration." Kelthan repeated the word slowly. "Your species wishes to join our military structure. Tell me, Captain, what exactly do you bring to an empire that has conquered 600 worlds without losing a single major engagement?" Jinho's expression remained professional, but something flickered in his gaze. "Experience, sir, different kinds of experience." "Experience?" The Admiral's laugh resonated through his throat chambers. "Captain, our youngest officers train for 30 years in our academies. They study every battle doctrine developed across known space. They can calculate fleet movements across multiple star systems simultaneously." Sergeant Park Min-soo stepped forward slightly, just enough to catch the Admiral's attention. The human was stocky and scarred, with gray threading through his black hair. His left hand was mechanical, clearly a battlefield replacement. When he spoke, his voice carried the rasp of someone who had breathed too much smoke and dust. "With respect, sir, how many of those officers have had to fight with broken equipment? How many have held a position when outnumbered 10 to 1? How many have had to make life or death decisions when their computers were offline and their communications were jammed?" The bridge fell silent. Subcommander Vexnala's bioluminescent patches flared with indignation. "You dare question our military superiority?" Park Min-soo didn't flinch. "Not questioning it, ma'am, just saying there's different kinds of superiority." Behind him, the other Earth soldiers stood at attention, but their presence filled the space in a way that made the pristine Vorthak officers uncomfortable. These humans looked like predators disguised as prey, wolves wearing sheep's clothing. Corporal Kim Hee-jin caught Kelthan's secondary gaze. She was young but carried herself with the confidence of someone who had survived what others hadn't. Her rifle, an ancient projectile weapon by galactic standards, hung across her back like it was part of her body. "Your weapons are primitive," Kelthan observed. "Kinetic projectiles, chemical propellants. We abandoned such crude technology millennia ago." Kim smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Sometimes crude works when sophisticated fails, sir. Plasma rifles don't function underwater. Energy weapons drain batteries, but gunpowder burns anywhere, anytime. Staff Sergeant Choi Yun-seo nodded toward the massive view screen showing space around them. Beautiful station, sir. Perfect engineering. But what happens when someone cuts the power? When the gravity generators fail? When the life support systems get damaged? Such scenarios are statistically improbable, Kelthan replied, but something in the human's tone made him uneasy. Respectfully, Admiral, Captain Jin-ho interjected, everything's statistically improbable until it happens. Earth taught us to prepare for the improbable. The Admiral studied these strange creatures from their war-torn world. Their equipment was patched and modified, their uniforms were practical rather than ceremonial, and they carried themselves like survivors rather than soldiers. Perhaps that was exactly what they were. Very well, Kelthan decided. You will be assigned to Sector 12, Station Epsilon 7, routine patrol duties, border security, nothing that requires our advanced tactical systems. He paused, letting condescension drip from his words. Try not to embarrass yourselves. Jin-ho saluted crisply, but his eyes never left the Admiral's face. Understood, sir. We'll do our best. As the humans filed out, their boots echoing in the sterile corridors, Sub-Commander Vexnulla approached her superior. Sir, why accept them at all? They offer nothing we lack. Kelthan watched the retreating figures on his display screens. Something about them bothered him, like an equation that refused to balance. Perhaps you're right, Vexnulla, but there's something about these humans. Something our calculations might have missed. He didn't know it yet, but he was absolutely right. Station Epsilon 7 had been a monument to Vorthak engineering perfection, gleaming corridors, automated defense systems, and strategic positioning that should have made it impossible to attack. For 6 months, the human garrison had walked those perfect halls, following patrol routes calculated by computers that never made mistakes. Captain Lee Jin-ho was reviewing duty rosters in his cramped quarters when the first warning came. Not from the station's advanced sensors, but from Sergeant Park Min-soo's gut instincts. Something's wrong, Park muttered, pressing his ear to the metal wall. 20 years of combat had taught him to read vibrations that computers missed. Hulls singing different, ships coming in fast. Seconds later, space around the station erupted in brilliant flashes as dozens of Nectar vessels dropped out of hyperspace. Their ships looked like flying scrapyards, mismatched hulls welded together, weapons bolted onto every available surface, engines that belched toxic fumes instead of clean plasma. The station's main alarm shrieked to life, drowning out everything else. Red emergency lights bathed the corridors as automated voices announced what everyone could already see through the viewports. They were under attack. In the command center, Commander Zalthek frantically manipulated holographic displays as his tactical computers tried to process the chaos outside. The Nectar ships moved like angry insects, swarming, diving, breaking away from formations before the Vorthak targeting systems could lock onto them. Formation Theta 7, all defensive positions, Zaltek commanded, his voice cracking slightly. The station's weapon batteries swiveled with mechanical precision, tracking targets that refused to stay still long enough to be hit. Sir, enemy vessels are not following any recognizable attack pattern, reported his tactical officer. Our predictive algorithms cannot establish firing solutions. Through the reinforced windows, they watched Vorthak patrol ships trying to engage the raiders. The Imperial vessels moved in perfect formations, their crews following battle doctrines, refined over centuries. But the Nectar fighters darted between them like piranhas, striking weak points and vanishing before return fire could find them. Maintain formation, Zalthek repeated desperately as his ships began taking heavy damage. Calculate new vectors, compensate for their irregularities. 2 decks below, in the human quarters, Corporal Kim Soo-jin was already checking her rifle. The weapon was a battered old thing, projectile-based chemical propulsion, absolutely primitive by galactic standards. But it had never failed her in 7 years of active combat. Movement outside, she reported to Captain Jin-ho, who was studying the tactical situation on a small screen. Looks like someone's stirring up trouble. Through their viewport, they could see Nectar boarding pods latching onto the station's hull like metal parasites. Cutting beams began slicing through armor plating that was supposed to be impenetrable. Staff Sergeant Choi Hyun-woo finished loading his grenade launcher with rounds he'd modified himself. Classic hit and run. They'll breach, grab what they can and disappear before reinforcements arrive. Jin-ho watched Vorthak security teams racing through the corridors in perfect formation, their energy weapons charged and ready. They moved like they were on parade, disciplined and precise. "They're good soldiers," he admitted, "but they're fighting by rules the enemy isn't following." The first breach came in Section C, where Nectar raiders poured through a hole they'd burned in the outer hull. They were ugly creatures, part organic, part mechanical, with too many teeth and not enough morals. Their weapons were crude but effective, designed to kill rather than impress. Vorthak defenders met them with textbook precision. Energy bolts lit up the corridor as both sides exchanged fire. But the raiders didn't advance in neat lines. They scrambled over walls, dropped from ceiling vents, and used the station's own structure against its defenders. "Sir, we're taking heavy casualties in Section C." A panicked voice crackled over the comm system, requesting immediate reinforcement. "Commander." Zalthek's tactical display showed red warning symbols spreading across his station like a disease. His perfect defensive positions were crumbling under attacks that made no logical sense. In the human quarters, Private Yoon Jae-min was taping his spare magazines together for faster reloads, a trick he'd learned in the urban fighting on Kepler 7. "Boss, we gonna sit this one out or what?" Jin-ho studied the battle report streaming across his screen. Vorthak casualties were mounting. Their defensive positions were being overrun by enemies who fought without regard for proper tactics or self-preservation. "Sir, request permission to deploy," Corporal Kim Soo-jin said formally, though her eyes were already calculating angles and distances. The captain made his decision. These weren't his people, and this wasn't his station, but he'd never been one. To watch good soldiers die when he could do something about it. Granted, show them how Earth fights. Choi Hyun-woo's grin was sharp enough to cut steel. About time. The humans moved out in small teams, nothing like the large formations favored by Vorthak doctrine. They split up, took different routes and disappeared into the station's maintenance tunnels and service corridors, spaces too narrow for proper military movement, but perfect for soldiers who'd learned to fight dirty. Sergeant Park Min-soo led his team through the ventilation system, crawling through spaces that would have been impossibly cramped for taller species. Behind him, Corporal Han So-young carried a shotgun loaded with shells she'd made herself. Not regulation, but devastatingly effective at close range. "Movement ahead," she whispered, her voice barely audible even through their comm units. 3. Raiders, maybe 4. Park checked his watch, an old mechanical thing that wouldn't show up on enemy scanners. Patience. Let them get comfortable first. Above them, the battle raged on. Vorthak soldiers fought bravely but predictably, holding positions that became death traps when the enemy refused to attack those positions directly. Their perfect training had prepared them for warfare against civilized opponents who followed the same rules they did. But the Nectar raiders weren't civilized, and the humans who were about to join the fight had learned their tactics in places where civilization was just a word people used to remember better times. In the lower decks, Staff Sergeant Lee Dong-hyun finished rigging explosive charges to the artificial gravity generators, not to destroy them, but to give himself control over something the enemy wasn't expecting to change. "This is going to get interesting," he muttered to himself, then keyed his comm unit. "All teams prepare for operation. We're about to show these raiders what happens when you pick a fight with Earth." The real battle was about to begin. The Nectar raiders had breached dozens of stations before. They knew the drill. Overwhelming. Force brutal efficiency. Grab what you can and disappear before serious resistance arrives. Station Epsilon 7 should have been just another quick score. They were wrong. Private Yoon Jae-min crouched in the darkness of Maintenance Corridor D7, surrounded by the familiar smell of machine oil and recycled air. He'd spent the last 20 minutes turning this forgotten passage into something the raiders would never forget. Emergency lights flickered in broken patterns, creating shadows that danced and shifted, scattered debris from his accidental demolition, work created perfect cover and deadly obstacles. The first group of raiders stumbled into his trap like amateur hunters walking into a spider's web. These Nectar weren't the brightest. Part cyborg, part alien scavenger, all violence. Their augmented eyes glowed green in the dim light as they tried to navigate the cluttered corridor. Jamin waited until they were committed. No way to retreat. Quickly. Then he opened fire. His assault rifle barked 3 times, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. The leading raider dropped instantly, its cybernetic implants sparking as old-fashioned bullets found gaps in its armor. The others spun. Around, confused, firing plasma bolts at shadows while Jamin had already moved to his second position. "What was that?" one of them snarled in their guttural language. Where did it go? They never found out. Jamin's next burst came from their blind spot, dropping 2 more before they realized they weren't hunting anymore. They were being hunted. 3. Corridors away, Sergeant Park Mi-young was having her own educational session with a squad of raiders who thought they'd found an easy route to the station's command center. They burst around the corner in typical Nectar fashion, loud, aggressive, and completely unprepared for what waited. "Contact left," Mi-young shouted, though she was already moving before the words left her mouth. A plasma bolt seared the air, where she'd been standing, but she was already diving behind an overturned maintenance table. The raiders saw her cover and focused their fire on it, plasma beams turning the metal cherry red. Standard tactics said she was pinned down, helpless until they flanked her position. Mi-young had never been much for standard tactics. She rolled left instead of right, came up in a crouch they weren't expecting, and put 3-round center mass into the nearest raider before it could adjust its aim. The creature's armor might stop energy weapons, but it wasn't designed for high-velocity metal traveling at 3,000 feet per second. The second raider swung toward her, but Mi-young was already moving again. 7 years of urban combat had taught her that staying still was the fastest way to die. She fired on the move, her shots punching through the alien's shoulder and sending it spinning into its companion. "Humans!" the surviving raider screamed into its comm unit. "There. Are humans here?" They fight like... Mi-young's final shot cut off whatever comparison it was about to make. Throughout the station, similar scenes played out as the human garrison showed the Nectar raiders what they'd really walked into. These weren't the pristine corridors of a Vorthak military academy. This had become the urban battlefields of Earth, where soldiers learned to turn every shadow into cover and every piece of debris into a weapon. Captain Jin-ho moved through the chaos like a conductor directing a deadly orchestra. His hand signals were barely visible in the emergency lighting, but his team read them like sheet music. 20 years of leading men and women through impossible situations had taught him that the loudest commander was usually the first one to die. "Team 2, flank left," he whispered into his throat mic, knowing that Corporal Kim Hye-jin would understand exactly what he meant. "Team 4, cut them off at Junction 7. The beauty of it was that none of his soldiers were where the enemy expected them to be. While Vorthak doctrine called for holding defensive positions, the humans flowed through the station like water finding cracks in stone. They used maintenance shafts the designers never intended for combat, fought from angles that weren't on any tactical map, and turned the raiders' own aggression against them. Staff Sergeant Choi Yoon-seo had taken control of Environmental Section. See, where he'd discovered something the station's builders never advertised. The air recycling system could be weaponized. With a few adjustments to the atmospheric processors, he could flood specific corridors with everything from blinding smoke to sleep-inducing gas. "Sweet dreams," he muttered, watching through a security monitor as a squad of raiders stumbled through a cloud of knockout gas he'd mixed from cleaning supplies and medical stores. They'd wake up in the station's brig with splitting headaches and a new respect for human creativity. In the lower decks, Staff Sergeant Lee Dong-hyun had turned the artificial gravity into his personal weapon. With raiders advancing down corridor G12, he waited until they were halfway through the section, then cut the gravity entirely. The aliens found themselves floating helplessly in 0G, their heavy weapons suddenly impossible to aim accurately. Dong-hyun, who'd trained extensively in weightless combat, moved through them like a shark among minnows. His mag boots kept him anchored, while his enemies flailed helplessly in mid-air. "Gravity's a harsh mistress," he said conversationally as he zip-tied the stunned raiders to whatever handholds he could find. The Nectar communication channels filled with panic as their easy raid turned into a nightmare. These humans didn't fight like any military force they'd encountered. There were no formations to break, no command structure to decapitate, no predictable tactics to counter. "They're everywhere," one raider screamed over the comm. "How many of them are there?" The answer was 20. 20 human soldiers against over 200 Nectar raiders. But those 20 fought like they'd learned warfare in the hardest school in the galaxy, a planet where conflict never ended and adaptation meant survival. Corporal Hanso Young proved that point when she turned a simple supply closet into a fortress. Using nothing but spare equipment and battlefield ingenuity, she'd created overlapping fields of fire that turned a 10-meter hallway into an impassable killing ground. The raiders tried 3 different assaults on her position. Each time they found angles of attack that shouldn't have existed, cover that appeared out of nowhere, and resistance that seemed to multiply the harder they pushed. Captain Jin Ho monitored it all from his mobile command post, a maintenance junction that gave him access to the station's communication systems. He didn't need computers to calculate odds or algorithms to predict enemy movements. He had something better: soldiers who'd learned to think like the enemy, move like shadows, and fight like their lives depended on every decision they made. Because, on Earth they always had, Admiral Kelthan stood frozen before his tactical displays, watching something that shouldn't have been possible. His sophisticated battle computers showed over 200 Nectar raiders aboard Station Epsilon 7, facing just 20 human soldiers. The mathematics were simple. The humans should have been overwhelmed in minutes. Instead, the raider casualties were climbing while human losses remained at 0. "Sir, this doesn't make sense," Subcommander Vexnala whispered, her crystalline voice trembling. "Our tactical analysis shows the humans are outnumbered 10 to 1. They should be dead." Kelthan's 4 eyes tracked the battle markers moving across his holographic display. The human soldiers weren't holding defensive positions like proper military doctrine demanded. Instead, they flowed through the station like smoke, appearing where the enemy least expected them and vanishing before effective counterattacks could be mounted. "Replay Section G12, he commanded. The tactical display shifted to show Staff Sergeant Lee Dong-hyun's engagement. The human had somehow gained control of the artificial gravity systems, something that should have required engineering clearance and hours of computer authorization. Instead, he was manipulating it like a weapon. The recording showed a squad of 12 Nectar raiders advancing down the corridor in standard assault formation. They moved with confidence, their heavy armor and plasma weapons making them a formidable force. Then Dong-hyun cut the gravity. What followed wasn't warfare, it was art. The raiders found themselves floating helplessly, their weapons suddenly impossible to aim in 0 gravity. Dong-hyun, equipped with magnetic boots, moved between them like a dancer. His rifle fired precise controlled bursts, while the enemies flailed around him like fish out of water. Gravity restored in 3, 2, 1. Dong-hyun's voice came through. The security monitors. The raiders crashed to the deck, stunned and disoriented. Before they could recover, the human had already secured their weapons and moved to his next position. "How did he access the gravity controls?" Kelthan demanded. His engineering officer checked the logs frantically. "Sir, he didn't use our systems at all. He jury-rigged the gravity generators using maintenance tools and spare parts. He created his own control interface." The Admiral felt something cold crawl up his spine. "In how long?" "Estimated time." 12 minutes, sir. 12 minutes to bypass systems that took Vorthak engineers years to master. The implications were staggering. "Show me Environmental Section C," Kelthan ordered. The display switched to Corporal Han So-young's position. She'd turned the engineering section into something that resembled a command center from a nightmare. Multiple screens showed different areas of the station, all connected through systems that hadn't been designed to work together. "Sir, she's modified the atmospheric processes," the engineering officer reported. "She's selectively controlling air quality in different sections of the station." On screen, they watched So-young monitor a group of raiders approaching her position. With practiced efficiency, She diverted cleaning chemicals from the janitor's storage into the air recycling system. Within seconds, the corridor filled with thick, choking smoke. The raiders stumbled blindly forward, their sophisticated sensors useless in the chemical haze. So young squad, equipped with simple cloth masks, soaked in neutralizing solution, moved through the smoke like ghosts, their weapons fired with mechanical precision, dropping the confused enemies before they could even identify targets. The atmospheric modifications should have taken hours to implement, the engineering officer whispered. She did it in 20 minutes using spare parts and cleaning supplies. But what impressed Kelthon most wasn't the technical skill, it was the tactical thinking behind it. So Young hadn't just improvised a solution. She'd anticipated 3 different enemy approaches and prepared counters for each one. "Display Private Yoon Jaemin's sector," he commanded. The screen showed a maintenance corridor that had been transformed into something from a military engineer's worst nightmare. Jaemin had somehow turned a simple passageway into a maze of obstacles, blind spots, and killing fields using nothing but debris and emergency lighting. The human crouched in a position that shouldn't have provided adequate cover, but somehow he had clear sight lines to 3 different approach routes while remaining invisible to anyone entering his zone. His rifle, an ancient projectile weapon, had been modified with components that definitely weren't standard issue. "Sir, he's attached a night vision scope, a laser rangefinder, and what appears to be a homemade suppressor," the tactical officer reported. "None of those modifications are in his equipment manifest." Where did he get them? He appears to have built them from spare parts found throughout the station. Medical equipment, communication devices, even components from the coffee machines. Kelthon watched Jaemin eliminate another squad of raiders, with movements so fluid they looked choreographed. Every shot hit exactly where it needed to. Every position change put him at the perfect angle for the next engagement. "These humans," Vex Nala said slowly, "they're not just soldiers, they're problem solvers." The Admiral nodded grimly. "Show me Captain Jin Ho." The human commander appeared on multiple screens simultaneously, not because he was in several places at once, but because he was coordinating actions across the entire station using a communication network he'd apparently built from scratch. "Sir, he's linked security cameras, intercom systems, maintenance sensors, and even the food dispensers into a single tactical network," the communications officer reported. "He has real-time awareness of the entire battle." On screen, Jin Ho spoke, into a device that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. "Team 4 raiders approaching from your 6 o'clock. Team 7 clean exit through maintenance shaft B. Team 2 stand by for gravity shift in section J." His commands were calm, precise, and somehow he knew exactly where every enemy and friendly unit was located. "How is he tracking everything?" Kelthon asked. "Sir, we're not sure. His communication network is using systems that aren't designed to interface with each other. It shouldn't work at all." But it was working. The humans moved like they were connected by invisible threads, each action supporting the others in ways that created devastating combined effects. Sergeant Park Mi-young demonstrated this perfectly. When she led a squad of raiders into what appeared to be a simple ambush, the enemies thought they had her cornered in a dead-end corridor. Instead, they found themselves caught between Mi-young's position and Corporal Kim Hee-jin's overlapping field of fire from a maintenance shaft above. The coordination was flawless, but there had been no radio chatter, no visible signals. Somehow, the 2 humans had anticipated each other's actions perfectly. "Sir, analysis indicates they're using micro-gestures, environmental cues, and timing patterns to coordinate without electronic communication," the tactical officer reported. "It's like they can read each other's minds." Kelthon realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history. These humans weren't just improvising. They were demonstrating a form of warfare that had evolved beyond technology and doctrine into something approaching instinct. "Vex Nala," he said quietly, "send word to High Command. Tell them we need to completely reassess our understanding of human military capabilities." On the screens, the battle continued to turn in favor of the vastly outnumbered human garrison. Each engagement showed the same pattern, raiders expecting conventional resistance, only to encounter tactics that seemed to bend the rules of warfare itself. These weren't just soldiers. They were survivors of a world that had forged them in conflicts beyond imagination, and they were about to teach the galaxy what real warfare looked like. The last Nectar Raider ship disappeared into hyperspace, leaving behind only debris and the bitter taste of defeat. What should have been a quick raid had turned into a massacre, not of the defenders but of the attackers themselves. Over 200 elite raiders had been reduced to fewer than 30 survivors, all fleeing in terror from an enemy they couldn't understand. Station Epsilon 7's corridors were silent now, except for the hum of life support systems and the occasional crackle of damaged electronics. Emergency lights still flickered in some sections, casting strange shadows on walls that bore the scars of a battle unlike anything the galaxy had seen. In the main command center, Admiral Kelthan stood before the tactical displays that showed the impossible truth. 20 human soldiers had not just survived an overwhelming assault, they had won decisively. His sophisticated computers were still trying to process how such a thing could happen. Captain Jin Ho entered the command center with his team, their uniforms dirty and torn, but their bearing still professional. They moved with the quiet confidence of soldiers who had faced death and walked away on their own terms. Behind Jin Ho, his veterans arranged themselves in a loose formation that somehow managed to look both relaxed and ready for anything. "Captain," Kelthan said, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there before, "your performance today was unprecedented." Jin Ho's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "We did our job, sir." "Your job?" Sub-Commander. Vex Nala stepped forward, her crystalline features reflecting the emergency lighting. "You destroyed a force 10 times your size using methods that don't exist in any military manual. How do you call that simply doing your job?" Sergeant Park Min-Soo shifted slightly, his mechanical hand opening and closing in a nervous habit he'd developed since losing the original in the siege of New Seoul. "Ma'am, on Earth, impossible odds are just Tuesday. We learned to work with what we had because that's all we ever had." The Vorthak officers exchanged glances. Their entire military philosophy was built on overwhelming technological superiority and perfect tactical execution. The idea of fighting with improvised weapons and jury-rigged systems was foreign to everything they understood about warfare. "Explain to me," Kelthan said carefully, "how Sergeant Lee Dong-hyun gained control of our gravity systems without authorization codes or engineering training." Staff Sergeant Choi Hyun-woo stepped forward with a slight grin. "Sir, during the water wars on Europa, we learned to turn environmental systems into weapons. When your infrastructure becomes your battleground, you figure out how everything connects. Gravity generators, air recyclers, power grids, they're all just tools waiting to be used." "The water wars?" Vexnala asked. 15 years of fighting. Over ice mines in the outer system," Corporal Kim Soo-jin explained. "No supply lines, no reinforcements, no backup. You either learned to make every system work for you, or you died in the cold." Private Yoon Jae-min nodded toward the damaged corridor where he'd made his stand. "The maze fighting in the Mumbai ruins taught us how to turn any space into a fortress. When you're fighting in bombed-out buildings with no two walls the same height, you get creative. Each human had stories like this, conflicts that had pushed them beyond conventional military thinking into something more primal and effective. The Vorthak had conquered worlds with technology and tactics. The humans had survived on a planet that never stopped trying to kill them. Admiral Kelthan's communication officer approached nervously. "Sir, High Command is requesting a full report. They want to know if the human tactics can be integrated into our military doctrine." The Admiral looked at Jin Ho, who was studying the tactical displays with professional interest. "Captain, would you be willing to share your methods with our forces?" Jin Ho was quiet for a long moment, exchanging glances with his team. These were soldiers who had served together through campaigns that would have broken lesser units. They communicated in ways that went beyond words, shared looks, subtle gestures, and an understanding forged in the crucible of Earth's endless conflicts. "We can teach you to survive," Jin Ho said finally. "But you need to understand something. First, this isn't warfare as theory. This isn't about perfect formations or calculated odds. This is about making hard choices when everything's falling apart around you. Corporal Han So-young stepped forward, her engineer's toolkit still strapped to her belt. "Sir, with respect, your people fight like they're in a simulator. Clean. Predictable by the book. Real war isn't clean. Real war," added Staff Sergeant Lee Dong-hyun, "is when your equipment fails, your communications are jammed, and your backup plan just got blown up. That's when you find out what kind of soldier you really are." The Vorthak officers looked uncomfortable. Their military training emphasized precision, order, and technological solutions to tactical problems. The idea of fighting with broken equipment and improvised tactics challenged everything they believed about proper warfare. "Your soldiers are brave," Sergeant Park Mi-young said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many good people die. "But bravery without adaptability just gets you killed faster. We can teach them to think differently, but it won't be easy." Admiral Kelthan realized he was looking at something unprecedented in galactic history. The Vorthak Empire had ruled through superior technology and disciplined tactics. But these humans represented something else entirely, the evolution of warfare beyond doctrine into pure survival instinct. "What would you need?" he asked. Jin Ho smiled for the first time since the battle ended. "Permission to break your rules. Sir, to teach your people that sometimes the best solution isn't the approved solution, that sometimes winning means throwing out the manual and doing whatever works. And realistic training scenarios," added Choi Hyunwoo. "No more simulator battles where everything goes according to plan. We'll show them what happens when the plan falls apart in the first 5 minutes." Over the following weeks, something unprecedented began happening throughout the Vorthak military. Human instructors worked with alien cadets, teaching lessons that couldn't be found in any textbook. They showed Vorthak soldiers how to fight with damaged equipment, how to turn environmental systems into weapons, and how to coordinate without sophisticated communication networks. The training was brutal, chaotic, and completely unlike anything the Vorthak had experienced. But slowly their forces began to change. They learned to think like survivors instead of conquerors, to adapt instead of following rigid doctrine. Captain Jin Ho stood in the rebuilt command center of Station Epsilon 7, watching mixed human Vorthak units conduct training exercises. The aliens were learning slowly but surely to fight the way Earth had taught its children, as if their lives depended on every decision. "Sir," Sergeant Park Min-soo said, joining him at the observation window, "think they'll be ready for what's coming?" Jin Ho watched a Vorthak cadet successfully jury-rig a communication system, using spare parts and determination. "They're learning that the best weapon isn't the one in your hands. It's the one between your ears." Outside, space looked peaceful and calm, but both soldiers knew that somewhere in the darkness, new threats were gathering. When they came, they would find a galaxy that had learned Earth's most important lesson: never give up, never surrender, and always fight like tomorrow depends on it, because it always does. The end.